Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to wait a moment before we get started, but I'm really glad to see people coming in to join us. And just so you know, your cameras are off. You can walk around the house if you want, and we won't see what you're doing. We're getting more people coming in, so we're just going to give everybody a little bit of time to log in before we start the presentation. And I'm going to wait and let my colleagues tell me what time we're starting. It's one thing I've noticed since moving to San Diego. This is an on-time city. Other cities I've been in, people don't show up early or on time for events. It's usually 10 minutes after. So we definitely want to honor the people who are coming close to on time, and we will start in just a few minutes. How are we looking on getting started, colleagues? We're just going to have a couple more minutes here. We are waiting for a few other people who RSVP'd. We're really fortunate to have Tom here with us today. I heard him speak, I guess that was last week, to our annual event where we bring our clients back who have commissioned us to watch him to mitigate the construction sites. And it's a fascinating event that has heavy machine operators and people who own the company, and a lot of fun to see everybody get back together and see the finds that we've had over the past couple of years. And so I know you're in for a real treat today to hear from Tom talking about paleontology here at the museum. We still have a few people joining us, so we're gonna, I'm getting the go ahead sign. So I'm going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Judy Gradwell, President and CEO here at the San Diego Natural History Museum, and I'm really glad that you're all joining us. Today, we're going to be hearing from a few people who, with real expertise in future planning. Tom Demaray prepares for and oversees the long-term care of our collections, ensuring that we're providing a home for them forever. And Danielle Barger and Diette Loeffler are estate planning lawyers and friends of the museum who both specialize in planning for the future of an individual's assets. So for those of you who love the museum, one of the many ways you can support our work and help ensure that for the care of our collections far into the future is to become a member of our Live Oak Society with a legacy gift through your estate. And naming the museum as a beneficiary is in your estate is one of the easiest ways to ensure that a cause and an institution you believe in will continue beyond your lifetime. No minimum gift is required, and nearly all Live Oaks members who complete a will or trust first name their family as beneficiaries and then decide either on a specific gift amount or a percentage of a residual that will eventually come to the museum. And I did just that. When I did my estate planning, I made sure to first take care of my children and my family, and then included a portion for the museum. I know that my legacy gift will be put to good use, and it was my honor to become a Live Oaks member. Legacy gifts help fund everything we do, including supporting our science and research activities, like the work of our curators, including the work of our curators like Tom Demaray. Speaking of Tom, we're going to get him on and get started with today's program. As a reminder, if you run into any difficulties, don't hesitate to ask for help in the Q&A box. If you're unfamiliar with the webinar format, both your camera and your microphone are disabled, so there was no need to get dressed up for this program. And enjoy the talk. Be sure to enter your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So it is my pleasure to introduce Tom Desmarais, who has been a member of our staff for 43 years. He's our curator of paleontology and our director of paleo services. And as that, he cares for our paleontology collection. He oversees our paleo services program and has conducted and overseen numerous paleontological resource projects ranging from initial resource assessments, impact evaluation, to actual mitigation of fossils when anybody's digging in sedimentary soils in our area. He's a terrific scientist and an amazing colleague, and it's my pleasure to welcome him. Tom.
Thank you, Judy. Let me just share my screen real quickly with everyone. Let's see. Are we all set? It's my pleasure to spend a little time with you all today, talking about the museum that I love and my role as curator of paleontology here at the museum. So as a paleontologist, of course, I explore the past, but the past really can inform us about the future a bit, and I'll talk more about that later. But exploring the past, but planning for what to do with the fossils that we've collected that are the direct evidence of past organisms and environments. And so I wanted to kind of go through some of the things that we do, but of course we're the Museum of Natural History, and we're run and operated by the San Diego Society of Natural History, which was incorporated back in 1874. So we're approaching rapidly our 150th anniversary. And the museum was founded by a group of citizen scientists who were very interested in the natural history of our region, and began collecting materials, and eventually those formed the nucleus for the collections of the society. And I oversee, as Judy mentioned, the paleontological collections here at the museum. And this is an example of some of the storage areas that we have for fossils. And you see we have specimens in cabinets, in drawers, all labeled, all data-based. This last...
So sorry, but we are missing your presentation. Would you try sharing your screen again?
You're not seeing it? I wish somebody had told me a little sooner. You're not seeing this?
We're seeing it now. Thank you.
Oh dear. I apologize to everyone for that. Hopefully you could hear me. So anyway, we were just looking at some of the collection storage areas for paleontology in the museum. And these are cabinets holding the collections of the museum. And the cabinets are in our area are stored on these mobile carriages that then can be compactorized and allow us to more efficiently use the collection storage spaces that we have available for us here in the main building in Balboa Park. I'm proud to say that I think all of our collections, research collections here at the museum are well cared for. And we're the current custodians of these collections that go back into the 19th century in terms of the accumulation of this material from our region. The region of our focus is Southern California and the greater Baja California Peninsula area. These are climate controlled areas. This is a photograph of one of our collection storage area down in Chula Vista at our offsite warehouse. And we're planning to bring these fossils back into the Balboa Park facility. And I'll talk a bit more about that, but that's part of the planning process. So Judy mentioned that we do a lot of our recovery of fossils in construction settings. This is a photograph of a site along I-5 near Genesee, where Caltrans is adding travel lanes to the I-5, and in the process of digging through sedimentary rocks that were deposited in the ocean about 48 million years ago in this area. And our field crew out there looking for fossils and recovering fossils. This example here is of a fossil heart urchin related to sea stars, and you can see the 5-part symmetry to the fossil here. And also collected from the same area, a crab. Here's the body, and then the pinchers or claws on either side of it. So fossils are recovered and conserved. So this is our way of doing conservation work with fossils, that we're salvaging a sample of fossils from these exposures, and then bringing them back to the museum and processing them, and then storing those fossils for future generations to study and appreciate. And I wanted to kind of go through a farm to table sort of scenario for collecting a fossil, and then how it comes from the field where it's been, in this case, a fossil whale in Chula Vista that's been buried for 3.5 million years. And it finds its way into the museum and into our collection. So here we have museum paleontologist Richard Cerruti starting to uncover the skull of this baleen whale. This is another view a little further on in the excavation, and the skull is upside down, so we're looking at the palate. But you can see the beautifully articulated vertebrae. This is how this animal came to rest on the seafloor, again, about 3.5 million years ago. Further on in the excavation, we're documenting the distribution of bones, kind of like a crime scene CSI plot of how the bones were arranged in the ocean floor sediments. There's a view of that drawing. So you can, again, the palate's up, and you can see this beautifully articulated series from the tip of the tail through the lower back and the upper back, where it was disturbed by the bulldozer, but 3/4 of a whale is better than no whale. And in recovery of the fossil, for vertebrate fossils anyway, involves this tried and true method of taking strips of burlap and soaking them in plaster of Paris, and then creating layer after layer after layer, often reinforced with some steel stiffening to make it more strong. And then we flip this over and bring it back to the museum where we prepare it. And here the skull has been turned over. We're looking at the top of the skull, and here's the blowhole and the back of the skull, and the orbit would be right down in here, the eye. And then eventually this fossil found its way onto the public display areas, at least the skull did. So this is in Fossil Mysteries as it's on display today. So we've seen it travel from being buried for 3.5 million years to being exposed by bulldozers and recognized by museum paleontologists, recovered, brought back to the museum, and then here it's being put on display. The rest of the skeleton, however, is in storage. So here's the vertebral column that we talked about a little bit earlier. So of course, in museums, we store material. Only the tip of the iceberg of the collections is ever on display at any one time. So quickly, why do we collect? In this case, why do we collect fossils? And for fossils, we're trying to conserve and preserve our regional fossil record for future generations. So we're planning ahead. And again, we are the current custodians of this collection that began being assembled back in the 19th century and passed on generation after generation of museum staff. We're the current custodians of that, and then we are going to be handing this off to the next generation. People ask me when I'm going to retire, and it's a difficult question to answer. So anyway, we conserve and preserve our regional fossil record. We also collect fossils to document the extinction prune branches of the tree of life. And I use this tree of life metaphor as the fact that the planet Earth has had organisms on it for a couple of billion years. And over that period of time, there's been this unfolding of this genealogy, this tree of life of all the variety of biodiversity that we see around us today. But most of that biodiversity has been, or majority of it has been pruned over time by extinction. And it's only through the fossil record that we're able to actually directly observe and sample and try to understand these extinction pruned branches of that tree. We're also collect fossils to document the membership and structure of past ecosystems. Who were the producers and the consumers, who were the herbivores and the carnivores and the scavengers, and how have ecosystems changed over time, or how similar are they? We also collect fossils to document ancient weather conditions and changes of past climates. For instance, 45 million years ago, this area was the site of tropical rainforests with estimates of 60 inches of rain per year, primarily monsoonal conditions, not unlike what we're starting to see here regionally as climates are changing. But that's one of the other reasons to collect fossils, and also to understand patterns and processes of evolution and of extinction. And also to, I think, better prepare us for a changing world by knowing what's happened in the past and how climatic changes have affected evolution, extinction, and ecosystems. We can kind of view or at least test what sort of changes we can anticipate going forward as we are facing these changes that are around us today. So this is an example of what we can glean from the fossil record. This is it's like an interpretation based on the fossils, on bones and fossil plants, but also on the rocks that we find the fossils in. So this is what we feel. It's a hypothesis, a graphic hypothesis of what life was like here in 28 million years ago. You see an open savanna grassland with ancient rhinos and early camels and a variety of other exotic animals in this area, based on the fossil record that we've recovered largely from fossil salvage operations. This is also Fossil Mysteries here at the museum, a reconstruction of life during that period of time when I mentioned we had tropical rainforests and mangrove-lined lagoons and estuaries. We also had at least 10 species of primates living in the forests of this area 45 million years ago. These are lemur and tarsier-like primates. So this is part of the fossil record and part of understanding what the history of this place has been over time. And also, because the museum is also a research organization, we study the fossils in our collections and then publish those so that they're part of the scientific record. This is a paper that just came out last week, by the way, in Biology Letters. The senior author, Ashley Paust, is our James R. Koklo postdoctoral fellow in paleontology. That's a position that's part of an estate gift from Jim Koklo, a longtime friend of the museum, that supports an endowment that supports Ashley in this case. But this paper describes a new species of false saber-toothed cat collected in Scripps Ranch 25 years ago, but just now being studied. Another paper in the Journal of Human Evolution is describing some of the fossil primates I mentioned from that period 45 million years ago, published in again, the Journal of Human Evolution. This paper published in the Zoological Journal of the Linnaean Society describes a new species of baleen whale, the primary specimen of which was collected on the Texas Street grade. This whale lived in our area 3.5 million years ago. Another example of a new record for giant bison from the Pala Mesa area along the I-15 corridor. And then finally, just another example, this paper published in the journal Nature describes what we hypothesize to be the oldest archaeological site in the Americas, based again on museum material collected by our staff and stored here at the museum. So I mentioned earlier that we're planning this to bring the fossils that are now at our offsite warehouse back to the main museum building here in Balboa Park. And this is a dream come true for me as a paleontologist and curator of the collections here, to have all the fossils together in one place, climate controlled, state of the art. The view here is of the south entrance to the museum, which we call the Scripps wing of the museum, which was dedicated in 1933. This renovation is of the basement floor of what's called the Clark wing, which was dedicated in 2000 and more than doubled the size of the original building. So the north entrance, and this is the area where the renovation is going to be taking place over the next couple of years as we plan for this. So this is the new home for the paleontological collections and labs. And it'll be state-of-the-art collection storage, increased space for future growth. And I just want to walk you through the plan if I can. So it begins with the foyer at the base of the stairs. This is the floor below the atrium. Parts of earlier exhibits have been down here. Titanic was here, King Tut was down here, Dead Sea Scrolls was down here. But this is the base of the stairs, and this is the artist's rendition of what the space will hopefully look like, with exhibits and windows looking into the main area for the paleontological collections. There'll be a viewing area in that room where there'll be additional exhibits and glass walls where people can look in visible storage into the actual behind the scenes part of the museum where we store the collections of the Society and Natural History Museum. Our fossil preparation lab will move down to this new floor from its present location on the 3rd floor. And this is just a view of what visitors will see. Museum paid and unpaid staff will be preparing fossils in full view of the public, and the ability for them to interact, the public to interact with our staff. And then the main collection storage area, which is really exciting for me as curator. This will be compactorized storage like we have upstairs, which will greatly increase our ability to grow the collection and to maintain it into the future. And so, again, visible storage, visitors will be able to look in and see the cabinets full of fossils, open shelving with those large fossils, the whales and dinosaur material and ammonites and so forth, and be able to see that this is an actively maintained collection and studied. So we'll be able to see people walking around, opening cabinets, moving carriages with fossils, and visiting scientists at work as well. Here's some statistics related to this. You can see that we will greatly increase the collection storage by about 34%. And we anticipate this will give us about 15 to 20 years of growth. And then I just wanted to finally emphasize the fact that the San Diego Society of Natural History has been around a long time here in the city. We're again approaching our 150th anniversary. This is a photograph taken out on Village Place back in the 20s, right outside of the west entrance to the original Scripps wing of the museum. And then I want to introduce Kate Stevens, who was the museum's first professional curator, and Frank Stevens, her husband, who was the first director of the museum, both involved in paleontology. Kate was a specialist in living in fossil mollusks, and Frank, in this photograph, is collecting fossils at Crown Point in Mission Bay, fossils that are here at the museums today with his notes on them, and we're taking care of them. They were let's say the founders of our paleontological collection. And they've passed on that legacy to the current generation, which is here, of the paleo staff here at the museum. And with that, thank you for your time, and look forward to the rest of this presentation.
And I believe we're going to hear next from Danielle and Diet.
Good afternoon. I'm Diet Leffler, and I have a firm over in Point Loma where we do thoughtful legal planning.
And I'm Danielle Barger with Barger and Batiste Law. We also do trust and estate planning. And I'm excited to talk to you today with Diet about estate planning. I think we've got a presentation coming up. Great. All right, if you want to, once that loads, go on to the first actual slide. So welcome everybody. Like I mentioned, I'm Danielle, and as an estate planning attorney, people often say, well, what is estate planning? And so we thought that it would be a good way to just define what that is so we know what we're talking about, because a lot of times people will call it by different names and they mean something else. So estate planning can really be thought of as the process of anticipating, planning, and arranging for the management and disposition of your assets in the event that you become incapacitated or pass away. Tom had showed us earlier a photograph of some of the collections at the museum, and that's stuff, right? And so many of our clients will have a lot of stuff in their house as well. And they want to make sure that those items go where they want them to go if something were to happen to them. And that is what estate planning is. It's making sure that somebody can stand in your shoes and manage your things if you're not able to yourself, as well as to make sure they get to the right person when you pass away. Next slide. That's you, Diet. And I think you're on mute.
I'm absolutely on mute. Thank you. Okay, so an overview of what estate planning documents are. The kinds of things you generally see in an estate plan includes a will. And most people think a will is everything, but in California, we use wills to pour assets into the trust in most cases. So the majority of people will have a will, but they'll also have a trust. And the trust is the big bucket, if you will, that holds all of the assets and provides all the terms for distribution during your lifetime, in the event of your incapacity, and then upon your death, where they will go. So that's the trust. So we call it a living trust or a revocable living trust or a family trust, but those are the basic terms used for a trust for an individual or a couple during their lifetimes. Another very important document you'll have is a financial power of attorney. And that financial power of attorney is a document that allows someone to handle any assets that are not in the trust on your behalf if you're not able to handle them for yourself. So it could be because you're traveling, but in most cases it's because you've lost capacity due to an accident, illness, or injury. There are also healthcare documents, which are a very important part of the plan for most people, because you're planning not just for your assets, but for your own care during your lifetime. So there'll be a healthcare power of attorney. In California, we call that an advanced healthcare directive. There'll be a waiver of HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And that's the fancy way of saying that doctors can't talk to anybody you haven't named ahead of time or at the time as someone they can talk to. So you'll get a HIPAA waiver that allows someone to talk to your doctors immediately without having to confirm that you're incompetent. You'll also could have a nomination of conservators, another similar document that provides the name of someone you'd want to have appointed for you. If you were to lose capacity, that person would be appointed by a court as a conservator of your person or your assets. Other documents we do are funding documents. Those are the ones that actually transfer ownership from you as an individual or as a couple into your trust during your lifetime so that the assets can then be owned and managed by the trust. But for all tax purposes, this trust exists on paper, but the taxing agency will tax you as the owner as though that trust didn't exist. Okay, Danielle.
So many different types of trusts out there. Like you had mentioned just a second ago, there's the revocable trust and the family trust. You know, sometimes clients will call me and they'll say, I think I might want an irrevocable trust. Dad, when would I want to have an irrevocable trust?
That's a very good question. Irrevocable trusts are usually come into existence when someone passes away. For example, you may have a married couple, and when one of those two people passes away, there may be a trust holding assets that belong to the first spouse who died, but they're there to take care of the surviving spouse for the remainder of his or her lifetime. That trust would be irrevocable because the surviving spouse doesn't own those assets, but benefits from their use. They get the income, they may get distributions of principal. And then again, when that spouse dies and the assets are then held for the benefit of minor children or disabled people, or just for people who maybe have a spending problem, they may spend too much. And so to regulate how quickly they can spend those assets, they may be held in an irrevocable trust. It's also possible to set up an irrevocable trust during your lifetime to make lifetime gifts. If you want to use the estate tax exclusion amount during your lifetime before it's reduced in 2026, that gets into more complicated planning, usually what we call generation skipping. But that's another example of it. A final example would be a life insurance trust. People will frequently set up an irrevocable life insurance trust to hold a life insurance policy that will pay out when they die, and the money can be used to pay the expenses of the administration or the estate tax if there is one.
Great. And so you had mentioned a trust and a will, and there's so many different documents. And I find that a lot of my clients get kind of confused between the different ones because different ones come into play in different times. So many times somebody will say, oh yeah, I have a will, and my will is going to say that my 401k goes to my friend Bob. Well, I wanted to take a second and just kind of explain how some of those kind of prevail, because when we're talking about who is going to inherit something, there is a certain order of operations that we're going to look at. Okay. So let's say that I, Danielle Barger, has a 401k through my company. When I set up that 401k through my company, generally somebody would have asked me and I would have input who the beneficiary is. And so I might write on my 401k that it's my account and the beneficiary is going to be you, Det. I'm going to leave it to you.
Thank you.
If I don't have a beneficiary and something is in my individual name, well, then what do we do? Then we look to what the title says. And that title is also very important. It's kind of separate and apart from that beneficiary designation. So let's say that I have a piece of property and I own it with my spouse. His name is George. Let's say that that title says Danielle and George as joint tenancy. Now I go and I see my estate attorney and I say that I want to leave everything to my friend Bob. Well, when I do that, that doesn't change anything that I've done with leaving my 401k to Det because that went through a beneficiary designation. It doesn't affect my title to my home because when it's joint tenants with my spouse in that example, joint tenancy means that if I die, automatically by operation of law, it will pass to the other person. So then what I want to look at is if I don't have a beneficiary designation, if there's not somebody else on title with me, well, then is there a trust? And if so, then we look to the trust to see who I'm going to leave my assets to. So it's really important to make sure you understand that there are three distinct types of ways in that scenario, and they don't necessarily trump one another. If you've got none of that, then that's when we look to a will. And don't you worry, if you don't have a will in place, the state has its own plan for you, and they have a very specific order of who is going to inherit what. And so keep in mind that when we're looking at who is going to inherit something, first, we're going to see, is there a beneficiary? Okay, if not, well, who else is on title? Is there another person on title in a certain way that's going to inherit? Well, if not, okay, do we have a trust? Is it titled in a trust? And if so, we go to that trust and see what it says. And if we've got none of that, then we'll head on over to probate court and follow the state's rules. Next slide.
Okay, so the next question is, who should be the beneficiary of your retirement plan? And you may have heard that the law changed for retirement plans back in 2019, right at the end of the year, something called the Secure Act. Now, retirement plans have a beneficiary designation, and you would complete that form with whichever place you acquired it from. So if you set up an IRA with Fidelity, you'll complete a beneficiary designation form with Fidelity. If you have a 401k with your employer, you complete the plan form with your employer. And that form is going to trump what happens to the assets in most cases. So but the Secure Act, before the Secure Act, the law was that you could leave your assets to your spouse and they could take it over their lifetime as though they were the original owner of the retirement account. And then it could be left to your children or your grandchildren, and they too could take it over their lifetime. So if assets were left in a retirement account to a 10-year-old, they could have a very long period of time over which to take those distributions, small amounts at a time. It stretched out the payments, and that's what we used to call it, the stretch. But the Secure Act eliminated that. So starting in 2020, no one can accept a surviving spouse or a beneficiary who fits specific categories, generally as a disabled person, and they have to be disabled within the definition by a certain age. And if they fit that category, then they're still permitted to inherit it on a stretch and take it over their lifetime. But everyone else essentially has 10 years from the time in which they inherit to withdraw all the assets from the retirement account. And as you know, when it comes out of a regular IRA or regular 401k, not a Roth, that money is subject to income taxes as it comes out. Now, the IRS has recently issued regulations saying that you have to begin in the year following the year of death. So withdrawals have to start essentially immediately and come out every year over that 10-year period. That initially we thought you'd have until the 10th year to start making withdrawals, but you'll have to start making those withdrawals immediately. So if you're leaving your IRA to your minor child, there's a problem right away because we don't want a minor child to have to take a withdrawal. So the law does say if someone's a minor, they can wait until they are the age of 18 and then they have to begin that 10-year withdrawal period. But at the same point, you may not want an 18-year-old to receive a very large IRA that they could withdraw all of in a single year right up front, or 1/10 of every year. If you have that kind of a beneficiary, you may want to do different kind of planning for your retirement assets than leaving it just using the beneficiary designation form to your minor child. As I said, leaving it to your spouse is usually the best way because they can still roll it over. But if you have a minor or you have a disabled person, you may want to have the assets pour into a trust for their benefits. And the trust needs to be properly designed, or all of the tax will have to be paid over a 5-year period instead of a 10-year period. So you really need to talk to a lawyer before you do anything with your retirement accounts, whether you're completing a new form or just deciding what kind of planning to do. The other thing you want to know is that creditors have an ability to go after an inherited retirement account. If it's held in a trust, however, they don't have the same access to that retirement account to go after it. So if you have a child who has had some financial difficulties or has some legal difficulties or has a spouse in a divorce, that could be a problem. You might also want to have those assets pour into a trust for their benefit. And even if the tax gets paid more quickly, it could still be protected from those creditors. So your situation may be specifically different than the average, but you should talk to a lawyer and see what your best options are, because you don't want to do anything that's going to make the money available to the wrong people at a time when they're too young or not competent to handle it.
So, Ed, I'm kind of rethinking. I said in my scenario that I was going to name you as the beneficiary of my 401k. But now that you've told me that, and now that I know when you take the money out, you have to take it out over 10 years. And you have to pay income taxes on it because this was a traditional 401k. So, I'm really thinking that. And I think that maybe I should name the NAT instead. And I bring that up because I see a lot of people who are charitably inclined, probably like many on this webinar today. And it's important to look at all of your assets, because if I were going to leave 10% of everything to the NAT or another charity or what have you, it's better if I leave it from a tax deferred account, because the NAT is not going to pay income taxes on it and you would. So if you are charitably inclined and if you do have retirement accounts, make sure that when you do talk to your attorney, you bring that up so you can make sure you're making the most robust gift as possible.
And can I add that if you were to decide you wanted to make lifetime gifts, the same rules would apply. So if you wanted to make a lifetime gift from the NAT and you made it directly from your IRA, it has to be one that's in payment mode. So you have to be 72 and a half. You could make gifts of any amount that you wanted to, up to $100,000 directly from the IRA to the charity. In this case, we're talking about the NAT, and no tax would ever get paid. So instead of $50,000 worth of taxes getting paid when you withdraw $100,000, and then you can get $50,000 to the NAT, they could get the entire $100,000. And if you do your distributions directly from an IRA, you can do this instead of taking your mandatory required distribution. So let's say you're required to take $5,000 this year from your IRA. You could have it paid directly to the NAT. You would never pay tax on that $5,000 withdrawal, and they'd have more money by twice as much as you would have if you took it and then donated the balance.
And that's a great thing to check in with your accountant on, because sometimes that $5,000 could bump you into another tax bracket. And so by avoiding it and not taking it into your income, it could give you some advantages as well. Next slide.
Okay, so the next question is estate tax. Now, you may know that the estate tax is a 40% tax imposed on assets when people die. There is an amount that's excluded from that tax called the basic exclusion amount. And in 2022, that amount is $12,060,000 per person. The law is actually going to, the exclusion amount is going up next year. They think to $12,920,000 a person. So it's pretty significant per individual because it's double that for a couple. But in 2026, by law, it's automatically being cut in half, and they're estimating it'll be around 6 million maybe. The reason we don't know for sure is because inflation is uncertain, and the way in which they index for inflation is different in the way they're currently calculating the exclusion versus the way they were before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. And we're going to go back to the old rules. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. But the amount that's excluded from estate tax saves you 40 cents on the dollar, if you will. Now, there are a variety of different kinds of trusts. We talked about a revocable living trust, but that's just the overall category. There's different kinds of trusts you can have depending on the size of your estate and your needs. If you have a layered family with lots of assets, meaning you've got some of his kids and some of her kids, and maybe some of their kids together, you're going to need a more complicated trust than if you have a couple that's been married forever and they only have 2 kids or 1 kid in common, and there's not a lot of grounds for contention or disagreement or confusion as to where things should go. So the real basic kind of a marital trust that we see is what we call an AB trust, which is a trust where when one of the 2 married couple dies, the assets get split essentially 50-50, with Trust A being funded by the assets that belong to the surviving spouse, and Trust B being funded with the rest of the assets, the one that belong to the deceased spouse. If you have more assets, you may need an ABQ, which means some of the assets are going to go to a Trust Q, that's a marital trust, that defers the tax on that share of the assets of the deceased spouse until the second person dies. And there's a lot of potential for complexity in whether you fund the B trust or the Q trust first, and there's a lot of reasons for doing that. But the basic thing is your standard trust for married couple is an AB or an ABQ or AQB, depending how your lawyer likes to talk about it. Another very common trust is called a disclaimer or an A disclaimer trust, which means that when the first spouse dies, all of the assets go to the surviving spouse, unless that spouse decides there's some tax benefit in not taking all of those assets or some creditor protection reasons not to do it. In which case, a second trust, a disclaimer trust, is also funded, and all the assets then take care of the survivor, but they don't own all the assets. Another version of that is called a second to die trust, and that's where nothing essentially changes at the first death. That both spouses hold the assets together, then one spouse holds all the assets, but there's no disclaimer feature. That's generally for a smaller estate where there's just no tax planning required at all, and they have no creditor concerns. A big thing happened in the estate planning law back in 2010 and became permanent in 2012 called portability. And as we're talking about, you have an amount you can exclude from the estate tax, the basic exclusion amount. And that exclusion used to have to be used when you died. But now, if you're a married person, we allow the surviving spouse to claim the use of that through a tax return filed at the first death so that they can use the exclusion later. So let's say that I have an estate of $10 million with my husband, and I die, and he has $5 million of his own exclusion, and then my $5 million is either to be used or expire, but he can claim it and use it for his estate later. That allows me to give him all of the assets for the rest of his life. And when he dies, he uses his exclusion plus mine. He ports it over, that's the word portability, and he uses it later. That kind of planning allows us to play around with the funding at the first death to figure out the best tax way to fund a trust. And I know it gets very complicated at this point, but basically go to talk to the lawyer. They'll help you with the best way to fund it. And you may be able to get a better tax result long-term by doing that. The last thing I was going to mention about the estate tax was the generation skipping tax. And I mentioned a little bit earlier that you can do planning for the use of an exclusion for gifts to children or grandchildren that aren't going to be owned by the child, but they get to use it. Generation skipping tax is a tax that applies when you make a gift to someone who's more than one generation below you. So if you make a gift to your grandchild, you would use some of your lifetime exclusion from the generation skipping tax. It's also a 40% tax. And the GST tax, you also have an exclusion amount that's currently $12,060,000. And again, we're getting to the very complicated planning here, but if you have a larger estate, you may want to use lifetime gifts or gifts at death that allow you to do more planning and more protecting of assets from taxes later.
So many taxes. So that is the death tax. We mentioned the income tax. Let's talk about property taxes too on the next slide. I wanted to give a little quick rundown of all these numbers that come to play when we're dealing with property taxes, because a lot of people get really confused. So here in California, once you buy a piece of property, as long as you continue to own it, it does not get reassessed every year. That's Prop 13. And that was back from the 70s. It's still around today. That means that if I was lucky enough to buy a property a number of years ago, my annual property taxes are a lot lower than somebody who moves in next door and bought it this particular year. So a lot of people understand this concept of Prop 13 and not having their taxes reassessed. Well, Prop 13 was expanded to allow a parent to pass on that low property tax base to their child in Prop 58. And that is what a lot of people know of today. And they go, yeah, I can just pass my low property tax base down to my kid, no problem. Well, that is Prop 58, but in 2021, that all changed with Prop 19. So Prop 19 is our current rule, and it really did away with Prop 58 in all but a very small circumstance. So I wanted to bring that up so everybody's aware. Right now, if I were to leave my property to my child, the only way that my child will be able to enjoy that low property tax base, and again, that low property tax base was afforded to me through Prop 13. The only way I can do that is if it was my primary residence, I live in it. When I pass, I leave it to my child, and my child moves in and makes it his or her primary residence as well. And I bring that up because it was something that wasn't widely recognized by a lot of people. So when I say that to clients, they often are a little bit shocked. So keep in mind that Prop 19 is our current rule, and you can't just automatically give whatever to a kid or a grandkid. There's some very specific narrow window that you can qualify for, but it's not automatic.
Can I add two more things to that?
Yes.
One is that if you give it to two children and one of them is actually living in the house, the entire property will qualify for the parent-child exclusion so long as there's no rent being paid. So if they both can use it and one is using it and claims it as a homeowner's exemption gets filed within a year of the death of the parent, then it will qualify. But if they ever pay rent or they move out and another qualifying person doesn't move in, such as that child's child or their sibling who owns the other half, then it will get reassessed at that time. And appropriate forms do have to be filed to claim the parent-child within 3 years of the death, or it won't qualify. So homeowner's exemption has to qualify, and it doesn't do it if you have rent. And the other half is that it has to be filed parent-child within 3 years.
Another one where you don't want to try and do that yourself. Talk to
Nope,
somebody
that's-
to help you. Excellent. All right, next slide. So I think that a lot of people think that if they have an estate plan or a trust, it just kind of automatically happens and there's not a lot that has to be done. And maybe we can just kind of quickly talk about how that's not always the case. There is some procedures that have to go through. What would you tell your clients, Deette, when you're wanting to make sure that they have their estate plan in place and they want to make it easy for those that come behind them?
Well, one of the first things I tell them is that they need to let that person know that they've been named to have that job, so that they can ask their questions while you're still alive, and you should share your plan with them so that they know what to expect. Particularly if you're planning to leave someone out or give unequal gifts, having a conversation up front can reduce the anxiety or the confusion or the shock that can occur. There may be, you have one child who's done extremely well and one child has had terrible luck, and just maybe they have a disability or they have just don't have the gifts that the other child does by natural skills, and they've just not done as well. So you've decided to make a larger gift to one than to the other. You need to explain that to both children so that they're not, the one who's done well and has worked hard doesn't feel they're being punished because you love the other one better. Another thing I would suggest is that, as Danielle was mentioning, you have beneficiary designations that you get for certain kinds of assets like life insurance or 401k plans, sometimes for other kinds of accounts, but I like accounts to be, financial accounts to be in the trust. But for each one of those that for which you signed a beneficiary designation form, you need to get a copy to confirm the company actually has the information you think they have. I can't tell you the number of clients who have sent away for a copy and discovered that the assets are going to their ex-spouse or are going to their 2 children, but they have 3 children now, or some other thing like that. So you get a copy to confirm it's right, and then you fix it if it's not, and you give a copy to your lawyer so that when the successor trustee takes over, they have that information immediately and they can contact the insurance company and say, yes, I have the form. Yes, this is the appropriate beneficiaries. And it goes so much more smoothly than if they have to guess, and the companies can tell them nothing, so they don't know who's supposed to be applying for that particular asset. I guess the other thing is that Danielle says is, write down key instructions. That's very helpful. Let your family know where the trust is, who the attorney is that you were working with or you want to work with, so they know who to call. There's usually, you'll have an estate planning binder in most cases. Make sure somebody knows where those documents are, and if it's in a safe deposit box or a safe at your home, that they have access to it so they can get into it. Because otherwise they're going to have to drill the safe or go to court to get permission to access the box, and they don't have proof that they have the right to access the box. So it makes it much more expensive for everybody than if you just provide that information up front.
Those are great tips. And I think if anybody is watching and they don't know the answers to some of those questions or they're not sure, they should reach out to their current estate attorney, reach out to their family. which you can advance to, has some contact information there as well.
Okay. And I'm thinking, do we have any questions?
I don't see any questions. So if there's our information again right there, if you need anything, and I want to thank you all for your time. And thanks, Det, for helping me kind of explain all this fun stuff.
I do see one question. It's how often you should review your estate plan, and that one every 3 years, every 3 to 5 years, or if something major happens, you receive a lot of new assets and inheritance, your child gets married, you have a grandchild, you lose your spouse, any big life changes, go back and take a look and make sure that your documents are appropriate and your new circumstances.
We have any other questions for Danielle or DeEtte or Tom in our last 2 minutes before we wrap up our session today? If not, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight and for your support of the museum, and a major thank you to Tom and DeEtte and Danielle. That was all very interesting information and extremely useful. How many trustees can we have is a question that just came in.
That's a hard one. You know, I have clients that'll have 3 kids and they want to name all 3 of them together. And I try and encourage them to maybe not do that because logistically it can be very challenging. I like to have one trustee and a backup and maybe another backup, but it's definitely going to be dependent on your situation.
And I agree. I prefer to have one trustee if possible. It's one of the worst scenarios I've ever seen is where they name one spouse, one family member from each family, his family and her family in a blended family. And they say, oh, they'll get along fine. Usually in that situation, it's much better to name an independent trustee, a financial advisor, or a CPA even, who can be the neutral person and assist everyone through that process, rather than trying to make the 2 families work together in ways that it's already a difficult time, and stresses get more difficult at that point.
I don't see any other questions coming in, so I want to thank you all again for joining us, and we hope to see you at the museum sometime soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.